Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, grab a blanket, maybe you turn the lights down a little, and just settle in. Tonight we're drifting back, way back to ancient Rome. Not the grand, marble-polished, toga-gleaming Rome you might picture from a movie poster. No, we're going to the real Rome. The messy, overcrowded, occasionally on fire Rome. The Rome where emperors made decisions that would baffle a moderately intelligent goat, and where the Senate spent an impressive amount of energy pretending everything was fine while absolutely nothing was fine. This is going to take a while, and that's the point. We're going to wander through centuries of Roman history the way a tired person wanders through a museum, slowly, without urgency, pausing at the interesting bits, letting the weight of 2,000 years of human folly gently press us towards sleep. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, and let's drift back to the city that allegedly wasn't built in a day, but was definitely destroyed in several. We should probably start at the beginning, or near it, because Rome, as a concept, begins with one of the most deeply improbable founding myths in all of human civilization, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. The story goes like this. A she-wolf found two abandoned infant twins on the banks of the Tiber River, and, rather than doing what wolves typically do, she decided to nurse them. The twins were named Romulus and Remus. They were supposedly the sons of the god Mars, because of course they were. Their mother was a Vestal virgin, which was supposed to mean she couldn't have children, and the entire situation was quietly glossed over by later Roman historians who had the self-awareness to realize it didn't fully add up. The twins grew up, founded a city, and then almost immediately had a disagreement about where exactly the city walls should go. Romulus wanted them here, Remus preferred there. They argued, Remus jumped over Romulus's wall, possibly as a joke, possibly out of genuine spite. The sources are unclear on tone. Romulus killed him, and that is how Rome began, with a fratricidal dispute over city planning. A perfectly reasonable start for a civilization that would go on to conquer most of the known world. Romulus then needed citizens for his new city. His solution was to declare Rome an asylum, an open city where anyone could come and live, no questions asked. Escaped slaves, criminals, exiles from neighboring towns, men fleeing debts or bad marriages or worse, they all showed up. Rome was, from its very first days, a city of people who had run out of other options. Romulus welcomed them warmly. He also needed women because his new population was almost entirely male, which was a practical problem. His solution to this was to invite the Sabine people to a festival and then, mid-celebration, have his men abduct the Sabine women. This event is known with remarkable delicacy as the rape of the Sabine women, and it is depicted in numerous extremely dramatic Renaissance paintings, which is its own kind of irony. The Sabine men, understandably, were not pleased. They came back with an army. There was a battle, and then, in what is either a touching moment of reconciliation or a deeply complicated piece of history, depending on how you look at it, the Sabine women themselves intervened, rushing onto the battlefield between their fathers and their new Roman husbands, begging everyone to stop. Peace was made. The Sabines and Romans merged into a single people. Romulus and the Sabine king Titus Tatius agreed to rule together, which worked out fine until Titus Tatius was murdered, at which point Romulus ruled again. Everything about this founding story is, when you sit with it, slightly exhausting, but it's important because it establishes the Roman character rather neatly. Romans were practical above all else. They did not overthink things. They needed women, so they took some. They needed citizens, so they accepted anyone. They needed to stop a war, so they let the women fix it. Efficient in a chaotic way. Romulus eventually disappeared. The official story is that he was taken up into the heavens during a thunderstorm, elevated to the status of a god named Quirinus. The less official story, whispered by historians who were clearly not invited enough parties to keep quiet, is that the Senate murdered him and disposed of the body. Both explanations feel very Roman. After Romulus came a series of kings, 7 in total, which is a suspiciously tidy number and suggests some editorial cleanup happened in the historical record. The last of these kings was Tarquin Superbus, whose name translates roughly to Tarquin the Proud, and who was by all accounts an excellent example of what happens when someone with very little self-restraint gets a great deal of power. Tarquin came to the throne by arranging the murder of the previous king, who was his father-in-law. His wife, Tullia, was apparently an enthusiastic collaborator in this plan, which says something about the family dinners at that particular household. Tarquin then ruled with increasing contempt for the Senate, the people, and basically everyone who wasn't him. He was a competent military commander, which Romans forgave a great deal, but his son Sext eventually committed an act of violence on a noblewoman named Lucretia that triggered a full rebellion. Lucretia told her husband and father what had happened, extracted from them a promise of revenge, and then killed herself. The Romans took her death as a rallying point. The Tarquins were expelled. The monarchy was abolished. Rome became a republic, governed by 2 consuls elected annually, because they had decided that the problem with kings was the longevity of the position, and the solution was to give the same amount of power to 2 people simultaneously for a shorter period of time, which created entirely different but equally interesting problems. And so, around 509 BCE, the Roman Republic began. Let that settle for a moment. Around 509 BCE. We are talking about an institution that lasted in various forms for nearly 500 years. 500 years of consuls and senators and tribunes and praetors and all the other gloriously overcomplicated machinery of Roman governance. 500 years before Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and the whole experiment began its slow, spectacular unraveling. The Roman Republic was, in theory, a beautifully balanced system. In practice, it was an elaborate arrangement for managing the ambitions of about 30 wealthy families who would have burned the city down before letting anyone else have a turn. The 2 consuls at the top held supreme civil and military authority. They served 1 year, and then they were done, which meant that every single year Rome had brand new leadership, which is either admirably democratic or completely exhausting depending on your perspective. Below them were praetors, who handled legal matters. Below them were censors, who managed the census and public morality, which was an enormous amount of responsibility to give to people who themselves were Roman senators and therefore not always paragons of restraint. There were also quaestors, aediles, tribunes of the plebes, and various other offices that the Romans kept adding whenever they encountered a problem they didn't know how to fix. To solve any other way, the Senate technically was advisory. It didn't pass laws, it issued guidance, but it controlled the treasury, it managed foreign relations, it assigned military commands, and it consisted of men who had spent their entire lives accumulating influence and were not about to let technicalities slow them down. When the Senate said something, people listened. When the Senate didn't like something, things had a way of not happening. The Senate was, in practice, the closest thing Rome had to a permanent government, which made it simultaneously the most stable and most self-interested institution in the city. Then there were the people, or rather the 2 categories of people, because Romans loved categories. Patricians were the old aristocratic families, the ones who claimed descent from the original Senate members appointed by Romulus. Plebeians were everyone else. For the early centuries of the Republic, this distinction mattered enormously. Patricians held most of the offices, owned most of the land, and had most of the power. Plebeians were citizens, they could vote, they could serve in the army, but they were excluded from the higher levels of government, and more practically were frequently crushed under debt to patrician creditors. This created what historians call the conflict of the orders, which is a very dry name for what was, in practice, several centuries of class tension punctuated by occasional crises. The plebeians' most effective tool was something called the secessio. They would simply leave, pack up and walk out of the city and go sit on a hill somewhere nearby, refusing to work, refusing to fight, refusing to do any of the things that kept Rome functioning until the patricians agreed to negotiate. They did this multiple times, and it worked, which says a great deal about whose labor was actually keeping the Republic running.
Over time, through this grinding, occasionally dramatic process of negotiation and crisis, the plebeians gained access to more and more offices. They got their own assembly, the tribal assembly, which could pass laws. They got tribunes who had the extraordinary power of intercessio, the ability to physically interpose themselves between a Roman citizen and any magistrate attempting to harm that citizen and say no. The tribune was, in theory, sacrosanct, untouchable. Violating a tribune's person was a religious offense. This made tribunes simultaneously the most protected and eventually the most dangerous figures in Roman politics, a fact that would become relevant when we get to the Gracchi brothers, which we will in time. For now, let's just note that by the 3rd century BCE, the Roman Republic had achieved something like a functional balance. Patricians and plebeians could theoretically hold the same offices. The assemblies gave ordinary citizens a voice. The Senate provided continuity. It wasn't democracy in the Athenian sense, Rome never had anything like that, but it was a system with enough moving parts that no single person could easily take control of all of them. And then Rome started conquering things, and the balance began to shift. Rome's military expansion in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE was, by any measure, extraordinary. They defeated Pyrrhus of Epirus, who showed up in Italy with war elephants and technically won every battle he fought and still somehow lost the war, which is where we get the phrase Pyrrhic victory. They fought 3 Punic Wars against Carthage, the great commercial power of the Western Mediterranean, in conflicts that lasted, off and on, for over a century. The second of these wars featured Hannibal Barca, one of history's most gifted military commanders, who marched an army, including famously war elephants, over the Alps in winter and spent 15 years campaigning in Italy, winning battles that destroyed Roman armies by the tens of thousands, and still somehow did not take Rome itself, because Rome simply refused to stop fighting. They lost at the Trebia, they lost at Lake Trasimene, they lost catastrophically at Cannae, where somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon, and they kept going. They raised new armies, they appointed new commanders, they eventually beat Hannibal by going around him, attacking Carthage directly, forcing him home and defeating him at Zama. The Romans were not always the most brilliant military strategists, but they were, without question, the most stubborn. By the time the Punic Wars ended, Rome controlled most of the Western Mediterranean. Then they turned east, and within another century, they controlled most of that too. Greece, Macedonia, parts of Asia Minor, North Africa, the wealth that poured back into Rome was staggering, and it created a problem. The problem was land. Specifically, the problem was that Roman law had long designated certain public land, the ager publicus, that was technically owned by the state and was supposed to be distributed or rented to citizens, including small farmers. In practice, wealthy landowners had been quietly encroaching on this land for generations, using it as if it were their own, and since the Senate was full of wealthy landowners, no one had done much about it. Meanwhile, the wars had taken small farmers away from their land for years at a time. When they came back, if they came back at all, they found their farms deteriorated, their debts accumulated, and large landowners with slave labor from the conquests undercutting their prices. The small farmer class that had formed the backbone of the Roman army was dissolving, and since military service required property ownership, this was becoming a practical problem as well as a human one. Into this situation stepped Tiberius Gracchus, tribune of 133 BCE, a man who was, by all accounts, intelligent, principled, and genuinely motivated by concern for the poor, which in Roman politics was a genuinely unusual combination. He proposed land reform, specifically enforcing the old limits on how much public land any one person could hold and distributing the excess to landless citizens. It was not, by most assessments, a radical proposal. It was essentially asking the wealthy to follow rules that already technically existed. But the Senate, which was full of the people who would have to give land back, was livid. They blocked Tiberius through his fellow tribune, Octavius, who used the power of intercessio to veto every attempt to bring the land bill to a vote. Tiberius responded by doing something unprecedented. He moved to have Octavius removed from office by popular vote on the grounds that a tribune who consistently acted against the interests of the people had violated his fundamental purpose. It worked. Octavius was removed, the land bill passed, a commission was set up to redistribute land. The Senate, furious, refused to fund the commission adequately. Then Tiberius did something else unprecedented. The king of Pergamum had just died and bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. Tiberius proposed that the wealth from this bequest should fund his land commission, rather than going to the Senate treasury as foreign policy proceeds traditionally did. This was a direct challenge to the Senate's control of finances and foreign affairs. When Tiberius ran for re-election as tribune, which was itself constitutionally dubious, the Senate decided they had had enough. A group of senators and their supporters, led by the Pontifex Maximus Scipio Nasica, armed themselves with chair legs and clubs and murdered Tiberius and several hundred of his supporters in the streets around the Capitoline Hill. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. This is the moment that most historians mark as the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, not because Tiberius was so important in himself, but because the precedent that was set, that political violence was an acceptable solution to political disagreement, that if you didn't like what someone was doing within the system, you could simply kill them. Once that precedent existed, it couldn't be unmade. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius Gracchus became tribune and attempted a broader program of reform: grain subsidies for the poor, extension of citizenship to Rome's Italian allies, further land distribution.
More politically skilled than his brother, more charismatic, better at building coalitions. He served 2 terms as tribune. When he failed to win a 3rd term, his supporters armed themselves. The Senate passed what was called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, which essentially declared a state of emergency and authorized the consuls to take whatever measures necessary to protect the state. Gaius Gracchus was hunted down and killed, or possibly killed himself to avoid capture. The sources differ. 3,000 of his supporters were subsequently executed without trial. The Senate had used emergency powers to murder the opposition. Again. Over the following decades, Roman politics became increasingly a matter of who had the most soldiers, the most money, and the least squeamishness about using them. A general named Marius reformed the Roman army, eliminating the property requirement for service and allowing landless men to join, which solved the manpower problem but created a new one. Soldiers now owed their loyalty to their general, who paid them and promised them land on discharge rather than to the abstract Roman state. Armies became personal, and personal armies in the hands of ambitious men were very useful things. Marius served as consul 7 times, which was essentially unthinkable. He used his armies and his political alliances to dominate Roman politics for years. Then his former subordinate Sulla decided to do the same thing, and the 2 men spent the late 2nd and early 1st century BCE in a grinding conflict that included, among other things, Sulla marching his army on Rome itself, twice, and Marius dying of natural causes at the age of 70 shortly after his 7th consulship, which, given everything that was happening around him, was almost certainly the best possible outcome available to him. Sulla became dictator, an actual official title in Rome for emergency circumstances, and used the position to execute his enemies through proscription lists, public lists of men who were declared enemies of the state and could be killed by anyone, with their property confiscated and a reward paid to whoever brought in their heads. It was systematic political murder with bureaucratic efficiency, which is extremely Roman. Sulla used the dictatorship to reform the constitution, restoring Senate power, then resigned and retired, which was genuinely surprising and made him almost unique among Roman strongmen. He died of liver failing shortly after, which might suggest something about how he spent his retirement. After Sulla came Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, the first triumvirate, 3 men who agreed to cooperate because each of them had something the others needed, and none of them trusted each other even slightly. Crassus had money. Pompey had military prestige and soldiers. Caesar had political skill and ambition, and a debt load that would have crushed a lesser man. Together, they managed Roman politics for years, each accumulating more power, each maneuvering against the others just carefully enough to keep the alliance functional.
Crassus died at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, defeated by the Parthians in a campaign he had launched largely to get some military glory to match his colleagues, because apparently being the richest man in Rome was not quite sufficient. The Parthians killed him and, according to some accounts, poured molten gold into his mouth as a commentary on his priorities. This story is probably not true, but it's the kind of story that attaches itself to a man like Crassus, and that alone tells you something about his reputation. With Crassus gone, there were two, and two ambitious men sharing power is a fundamentally unstable arrangement. Julius Caesar is one of those figures who has been so thoroughly absorbed into myth and drama and Shakespeare and film that it's easy to forget he was a real person with a real life that was, in many ways, deeply strange before he became the man who changed the world. He was born, probably, in 100 BCE. His family was patrician but not particularly wealthy or influential. His aunt Julia was married to Marius, which gave him a connection to the populist tradition that would shape his politics. As a young man, he was kidnapped by pirates, which happened to wealthy Romans sailing the Mediterranean with some regularity. Caesar, while being held for ransom, reportedly chatted pleasantly with his captors, joined their games, told them he would crucify them all when he was free, and was generally so cheerful about the whole thing that the pirates were charmed despite themselves. When the ransom was paid and he was released, he immediately raised a fleet, captured the pirates, and crucified them all, just as promised. He was, however, considerate enough to have their throats cut first, as the quicker death was a mercy. This is a very Caesar story, efficient, slightly unsettling, oddly principled in its own way. He was deeply in debt for most of his early career, which drove him to pursue political offices that came with military commands, that came with opportunities to acquire wealth through conquest, which is a through line in Roman politics that everyone understood and no one discussed politely. He was elected for various offices, made alliances, navigated the extremely dangerous waters of late Republican politics with considerable grace, and eventually got himself a command in Gaul, which is roughly modern France and parts of surrounding regions. His campaigns in Gaul lasted 9 years from 58 to 49 BCE. They were extraordinarily brutal. Caesar himself wrote about them in his Gallic Wars, a document that is simultaneously one of the most readable pieces of Latin prose ever produced, and an account of genocidal violence described with the flat calm of a man filing a quarterly report. He killed and enslaved enormous numbers of people. He fought dozens of campaigns. He crossed the Rhine into Germany twice, mainly to make a point. He invaded Britain twice, less successfully, but again, mainly to make a point. He accumulated wealth, experienced soldiers loyal to him personally, and a military reputation that made him one of the most powerful men in the Mediterranean world. The Senate, watching this from Rome with increasing alarm, eventually demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand trial for various alleged irregularities in his command. Caesar knew perfectly well that returning as a private citizen would result in prosecution, conviction, and political ruin, because that is what happened to men the Senate wanted to destroy. So, in January of 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary beyond which Roman generals were forbidden to bring their armies, with his army still intact, and marched on Rome. Pompey, who was supposed to be defending Rome, decided that discretion was the better part of valor and retreated to Greece. The Senate fled. Caesar walked into Rome without a battle. The civil war that followed took most of the Mediterranean world and ended with Caesar victorious, Pompey dead, assassinated in Egypt by agents of the Ptolemaic court who thought murdering Rome's general would please the winner, which was a miscalculation, and Caesar standing at the center of what was technically still a republic and practically nothing of the sort. Caesar was named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, meaning not for the traditional emergency term of 6 months, but forever. He was given a long list of honors, including having his image put on coins, having his name named after him, and being treated with increasing divine ceremony. He wore the red boots of the ancient Alban kings. He sat on a golden chair. He was offered a crown at a public festival by Mark Antony. He declined it 3 times, in what most observers read as a theatrical refusal designed to test the public reaction rather than a genuine reluctance. The public reaction was not enthusiastic. Caesar was sensible enough to notice. He was planning a military campaign against Parthia, presumably to avenge Crassus and also to acquire more wealth and soldiers and glory, because for a Roman of his generation there was no other speed he'd ever went.
Ides of March, 44 BCE, a group of senators calling themselves the Liberators, a very Roman name for a conspiracy of about 60 men, stabbed him 23 times in the theater of Pompeii.
He died at the base of Pompey's statue, which is either meaningful symbolism or a coincidence that history has found impossible to ignore. The conspirators thought killing Caesar would restore the Republic. Instead, it triggered another round of civil wars that lasted more than a decade and ended with Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, who gave himself the title Augustus, meaning the revered one, as the first Roman emperor, with a power so complete and carefully disguised behind republican forms that the Senate applauded while being methodically stripped of everything that mattered. The Republic was over. The empire had begun. Let's take a breath and drift into it slowly. Augustus Caesar is perhaps the most successful political rebranding in human history. He took the wreckage of a century of civil wars, a political system that had eaten itself alive, and a population exhausted beyond endurance, and he rebuilt it, carefully, patiently, brilliantly, into something that lasted, in various forms, for another 4 centuries in the West and considerably longer in the East. He was also, by most accounts, a deeply odd man in his personal habits, which makes him considerably more interesting. He was small. Ancient sources describe him as short, with uneven teeth, light eyes that he apparently liked to claim were unusually bright and penetrating, and a body that was perpetually fragile. He suffered from what sounds like a combination of chronic illnesses, respiratory problems, digestive issues, a sensitivity to cold that led him to wear multiple layers of clothing even in mild weather, and to never go anywhere without a hat. He was not the physical image of Roman military power. He was aware of this and spent considerable energy crafting the image of himself that appeared on coins and statues, tall, serene, classically proportioned, radiating calm authority. The propaganda worked extremely well. We still picture him that way. He was also deeply superstitious, which he shared with most Romans, but practiced with unusual dedication. He was terrified of thunder and lightning, and would retreat underground or into a vaulted room whenever a storm approached. He collected omens obsessively. He wore a sealskin amulet as protection against lightning, because sealskins were supposed to protect against lightning, which is the kind of folk belief that makes you realize that even the most sophisticated civilizations have their gaps. He paid close attention to dreams, both his own and others, and took the advice of his dreams seriously enough to occasionally act on it in matters of state. His private life was complicated in ways he found frustrating. He had one daughter, Julia, by his second wife, and no legitimate sons. He tried repeatedly to establish succession and found himself thwarted by biology with a relentlessness that would have tried anyone's patience. His nephew, Marcellus, whom he had groomed as a successor, died young. His generals, Agrippa and then Drusus, whom he had also positioned for succession through marriage, died at unhelpful moments. He adopted Agrippa's sons by Julia, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, and watched both of them die before reaching adulthood. He eventually settled on his stepson Tiberius, whom he didn't particularly like and who didn't particularly like him, and that tension shaped the next dynasty in interesting ways. Julia herself was a source of considerable grief, or at least considerable political inconvenience, which for Augustus amounted to the same thing. She was reportedly witty, educated, and charming, and also, if the sources are to be believed, engaged in a series of affairs that became enough of a public scandal that Augustus, who had spent years legislating public morality under his social reform programs, was forced to exile his own daughter. He exiled her to a small island with a reduced household and refused for years to allow her wine. Whether this was genuine paternal anguish or political calculation, or both, is at this remove genuinely unclear. Probably both. His marriage to Livia Drusilla was apparently one of the most successful partnerships in Roman imperial history. He divorced his second wife to marry her. She was pregnant with another man's child at the time, which Livia and her first husband apparently accepted with admirable practicality, and they remained married for more than 50 years until his death. Livia was intelligent, politically acute, and enormously influential, which made her the subject of enormous suspicion in both ancient and modern assessments. Later Romans, particularly under the reign of her son Tiberius, accused her of poisoning Augustus and various of his potential heirs to clear the way for Tiberius. The historian Tacitus was particularly unfond of her. Whether any of it is true is impossible to know.
What is clear is that she was one of the most powerful women in Roman history, that she navigated the extraordinarily dangerous world of imperial succession with her position intact, and that she lived to be 86 years old, which suggests either excellent health or excellent instincts, or possibly both. Augustus died in 14 CE at the age of 75, which was a remarkable age for anyone in the ancient world, and especially remarkable for a man who had been physically fragile his entire life. His last words, according to Suetonius, were addressed to his friends assembled around him. He asked whether he had played his part in the comedy of life well enough, quoted a line from a Greek play about applauding if the performance had pleased them, and died. It is a remarkably composed exit for a man who had spent 60 years accumulating and consolidating power. Or it's a story that later writers found appropriately theatrical. With Augustus, the performance and the reality are always difficult to separate, which is maybe the most fitting epitaph for the man who invented the role.